Right, welcome everyone. Special welcome. Very happy that you are here. I assume that many people who would have loved to come today are at the No Kings protests, but we appreciate your attendance here. And a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Alexis Peri, who is an associate professor of history at Boston University, also already the publisher of an award-winning book, The War Within, Diaries of the Siege of Leningrad. But we are here today to discuss and celebrate her new book, which you can see here, Dear Unknown Friend, which is a very special one, and which I would say could have been written specifically for the Winner Museum. We are at the museum always very interested in the tensions between history with a capital H, the reference book kind of history on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the personal stories, experiences from people that can align with the broader historical narrative, but more often than not are completely contradictory. And I think that makes history so interesting. Its layered character and the different perspectives you can discover when you delve deeper into the past. The Winner Museum also, and you can see that in our current exhibition, Counter/Surveillance, is especially interested in doing away with the very stereotypical, strict model of the Cold War as a bipolar ideological struggle. There were way more parallels and communications during that time between East and West than most people think was possible. And I think your book, Alexis, is such a brilliant example of that. It's also a very special book. Came about thanks to a discovery you made at the Russian State Archives. I won't give away too much, but yeah, you will hear that she found thousands of letters, or at least more than 1,000 letters, were written by American and Soviet women in the period between 1943 and 1956, trying to connect to each other, understand each other. One really beautiful example I found was the 23-year-old curator of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow in correspondence with a 46-year-old housewife in rural Kansas who raised cattle and wheat. They got to know each other, they got to understand each other, and they got to admire each other. And you can see that on such a personal level, gaps can be bridged that otherwise seem unbridgeable. And that actually makes this book so relevant nowadays in a time when people live in completely different bubbles and completely different realities. I think you have a lesson to teach here. So please give a warm applause and warm welcome to Alexis. Yeah. And before I hand it over, I also want to give a special thanks to our team. Rachel and Julie are here, and yeah. Clara and Isaac are doing the technical side of things today, and they all make days like this possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thank you to everyone here who helped me come and gave me this opportunity to share this work with you. I'll just dive right in, and I'll start with a letter. My dear unknown American friend, I like America, and I'd like to know more about this country and about American people. It seems to me that American radio broadcasts for the USSR, I always listen in, only prevent us from getting a correct impression about the United States and the American people. I shouldn't think the voice of America is really the voice of American people, and that's why I'd like to hear from a real live American who would tell me about the life of your people, what they really think and feel. And I'd also like you to tell me about your own life, what you do, your thoughts, and your aspirations. So this letter was written by Olga Melnikovskaya. She was a Moscow-based archaeology student, and this letter was written exactly 77 years ago today, in 1948, was just lucky that the talk was on this date so I could share it. And by the time that she was writing it, hostilities, as you know, between the United States and the Soviet Union had sharply escalated. We have the Marshall Plan in the West and the communist takeover of 7 countries in the East. Europe is incredibly divided, and the information wars between the US and the USSR were intensifying. The State Department, right at this time, was ordering the Voice of America to sharpen its tone. And this letter was written the same year that the Soviet government began to jam Voice of America. Shortly after this, the Soviet state passed numerous decrees demanding anti-Americanism in plays and in books, and even the circus. And McCarthyism and anti-communism, of course, raged in the United States as well. And yet, here was this young woman in Moscow writing the first of dozens of letters that she sent to an American pen pal with the party's permission and the state's assistance. And in the letter, Olga Menikovskaya insists that it's only by cutting through the type of noise and propaganda I just mentioned to you that Soviets and Americans could connect on a personal basis and find ways to live in peace. Here's Olga here. She continues in the same letter, quote, "I deeply believe in your nation, the ordinary people, who," she added, "cannot want war with its countless sufferings and bloodshed and privations and hunger." And that's why she set about becoming acquainted with the, quote, doings and thoughts and aspirations of a real live American. And it was through this personal and the everyday, that international tensions could be eased. So Melnikovskaya makes this plea for peace. It's a kind of message in a bottle. It goes to the United States with no specific addressee in mind. And 2 months later, she gets an exuberant reply from this lady here, Jean Yar, who's a housewife living in Brooklyn, New York. And she writes, "My dear friend Olga, I read your warm and friendly letter of October 15th. No, I'm off on 3 days, sorry. Almost, so 78 years and 3 days. And I've long wanted to correspond with someone in the USSR. I'm curious, and I want to learn more about your country and your way of life. Here, we've gotten so many sensationalized messages about Russia, and I wanted to learn the other side of the matter from a Soviet citizen." So they're seeking information here as well as friendship, and hope to find both in a quote-unquote ordinary woman like themselves. So I spent 7 years eavesdropping on hundreds of conversations like this that were recorded in thousands of letters. Yar and Melnikovskaya were 2 of 762 Soviet and American women who corresponded at this time in order to advance understanding and peaceful relations between their countries. And I do focus on this particularly turbulent time between 1943 and 56. These are years marked by Stalinist isolationism, Truman's containment policy, McCarthyism, its Soviet corollary Zhdanovshchina, the anti-American campaign, the banning of marriages between Soviet citizens and foreigners, loyalty oaths in both countries, and consider that in the late 1940s, only 57 American civilians set foot in the Soviet Union. And yet we have hundreds of women sending letters back and forth. I had no idea this program existed. And for years, I taught my students, because I was taught, that there was basically no contact between American and Soviet civilians during the late 1940s. But discovering this program forced me to rethink how we periodize and how we conceptualize the Cold War. The project actually continues through the 1960s, and it eventually expands to dozens of countries. In this book, I try to tell a story about how these women, who are still reeling from the Second World War, and they're fearful that their male politicians will begin a new war, cultivated what they considered a new women's style of diplomacy, a diplomacy of the heart. And this was basically the idea that heartfelt storytelling and expressions of empathy could actually be mighty political forces, strong enough to help win wars and secure peace. So throughout the Second World War and the early Cold War, which American and Soviet statesmen waged primarily by displaying aggression, the Soviet pen pals experimented with displays of vulnerability, and they explored the possibility that opening themselves up emotionally to their country's historic enemy could be politically expedient rather than politically risky. And they adopted this diplomacy of the heart, not because they're somehow inherently emotional, but really because they recognize that in order to influence someone, you must connect with them first. One pen pal, who was a department worker in Detroit, a department store clerk, I should say, in Detroit, Verena Kohler, described it this way. She says, "It seems so important for people in our two great nations to get to know one another better, not on state matters, but small or domestic details which so touch the heart. Because in the end, it is the heart and not the head that is the main source of our motives, of our actions." So the idea here is that the key to mending relations between the US and the USSR lay not in the analytical, but in the emotional, in everyday matters more than in policy. The goal that drove these sometimes decade-long correspondences was peace and heartfelt communication. But that was never the official purpose of this program, which was, it won't surprise you, propaganda. The program began in 1941, and it was born out of the Soviets' desperate desire to repel the Nazis and to rally its Western allies into action. So in 1941, the Soviet Information Bureau created 5 anti-fascist committees, including one of women. And the job of those committees was to convince the Western allies to send more aid to the Soviet Union and to open a second front in Europe. And to do this, the Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, which won't surprise you was the least well-funded of the group, came up with a kind of wild idea. And that was to give Soviet women who were not trained propagandists, who were not even party members, who were not well-known heroes of socialist labor, to give them unprecedented and regular access to someone who was not a socialist or a fellow traveler, but someone living in the bourgeois capitalist West. And miraculously, the program was approved, but only for women and children. And the purpose of the program was, of course, strategic. But Soviet women who participated in it seldom adhered to that goal. I only found a small handful of letters that actually asked for military aid at all. But scores of letters from Soviet women asked for emotional support. They shared stories of heartbreak about losing husbands and children and parents. These are just 2 examples here, one from Nadezhda Stepanova, who was a child whose parents were taken and burned when her village was occupied, and another woman writing, asking that her letter be paired with someone like her, the wife of a frontline soldier. So maybe this early plea for emotional solace and connection is why many of the pen friendships outlasted both the war and the US-Soviet alliance. Once the war was over, the official Soviet goal for the program shifted from rallying troops to champion socialism. But still, the Soviet pen pals continued to privilege personal stories over party objectives. To be sure, both Soviet and American letter writers frequently touted their country's ideals. In effect, both sides did a great deal of promotional work for their nations, and every letter is a mix of propagandizing and peacemaking. But what's really notable is how they do this. They do it by embedding every claim in a personal story about their own lives, by avoiding abstract ideology and party speak, and by deliberately discarding their political leaders' belligerent, self-righteous rhetoric, scripts that were so available to them, whether on the radio or in the media, print media. The pen pals certainly had spirited debates, and they had lots of opportunities to go for the jugular, whether it was about Jim Crow in the United States or the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. But they didn't. With every disagreement, they kept returning to empathetic intent, and they learned to disagree without making the other person wrong, always prioritizing the pen friendship over winning any one argument. They practiced the arts of politics and of friendship at the same time. So if we return to the letter that I mentioned to you, the first letter from Olya Melnikovskaya, it's interesting to note that she penned this letter the same week that Secretary of State Marshall urged Voice of America, now under State Department control, to step up its attacks on Soviet misinformation. And the same week that the Foreign Policy Department of the Communist Party chastised informational agencies, including the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, for not being vigilant enough against, quote, American reactionaries, and ordered them to strengthen their campaign against Voice of America specifically. The Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee passed that directive onto the pen pals. And when you think of it from that context, Melnikovskaya, in a way, fulfills the letter of this mandate. She does critique Voice of America, but she does it in this way that embraces ordinary Americans. She says, I like America, which was certainly not what the Communist Party had in mind for her to say. And she expresses this affinity with American thoughts and feelings. This is the diplomacy of the heart at work. It was a model for how to listen productively and empathize with someone without having to agree with them. The pen friends would go on and use questions and stories, compliments, even recipes, jokes, and advice as way to convey their arguments. They gave their messages power, not by being forceful, but by being friendly. And by the way, this style, this diplomacy of the heart style, stands out in very sharp contrast to the letters of 6 men who desperately tried to join the pen pal program, but were repeatedly rebuffed, I should say, because their letters read like treatises. They were dry, argumentative, and devoid of personal charm. This is one Ukrainian pen pal letting her would-be male pen pal down easy, saying, I'm sorry to say of his letter, it gave me no real idea of you at all. So all of these men eventually were rejected from the project on those grounds. I think it's worth reiterating that in our current political moment today, when Americans of different political stripes, let alone Russians and Americans, are having trouble listening to one another, the letter writer's steadfast commitment to elevated discourse commands our attention and our respect. We've returned to a time when the United States and the Russian governments have limited contact between their citizens, whether through travel, through economic ties, or even just the sending of posts in the mail. The question now, as it was in the late 40s and early 50s, is but less contact really the right way to lessen tension? I personally found these women inspirational. They took tremendous risks in corresponding. Jean Yar, for example, was regularly visited by the FBI, even when she moved from New York City to Wisconsin. And in addition to taking great risks, the pen pals really offer a model of how to talk with someone who doesn't share your views and who is immersed in disinformation about your way of life. This was a program that was entirely initiated by women, and its participants were women who had never been abroad and who had very little opportunity otherwise to engage in international politics. It was a program that started 12 years before the Geneva Conference, 13 years before Khrushchev's thaw, 15 years before the first cultural exchange treaties were signed between the United States and the Soviet Union, which of course gave rise to lots of citizen diplomacy ventures. The participants and organizers of the pen pal program even sent a model nursery and worked to send a model American kitchen to the Soviet Union 16 years before US officials had this idea. So much of the diplomatic work we credit to men like Eisenhower and Khrushchev was already a decade in the making by women. The pen friendships lasted longer than anyone expected, and some pairs sent as many as 30 letters to one another. But the program was considered a dismal failure by both the American and the Soviet officials who oversaw it, and for the two same reasons. First, both governments were really hoping to glean some useful intelligence by surveilling the program, but the pen pals did not exploit certain juicy conversational threads that were ripe for espionage. Here's just one example from a letter by Jean Wolfe, who lived in Manhattan, Kansas, and she just drops into one letter, oh, well, my sister lives in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the Atomic Commission operates, and her husband was a major in the Army and now works for the commission. This elicited no reaction, no response, no questions from her Soviet pen pal at all. I'm sure the Soviet overseers were just furious that she didn't follow up on this. So that's the first reason, is that there was too little useful intelligence. And the second reason was that both governments were disappointed that there was so little promoting communism in these letters. Anti-Soviet, anti-communist crusaders in the FBI and in Congress and the Department of Justice were eager to hold up this program as evidence of communist infiltration, and they repeatedly failed to prove this in court. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Central Committee in particular was also disappointed, of course, that the Soviet letters were not propagandistic enough, at least not in the heavy-handed way that they recognized. They moved to cancel the program in 1951 because they just saw it as idle chatter between women, a waste of resources. So the diplomacy of the heart was clearly lost on both governments. And to the dismay of both sides, pro and anti-communist, none of the letter writers ended up declaring that their pen pal had turned them either to communism or to capitalism. But if we move away from ideological conversion as the only measure of success, we can glean some subtler, more diffuse power that these conversations had. They helped raise the political, and in particular the feminist consciousness of the women who corresponded, showcasing how the personal was political. As the pen pals learned about each other's lives, they began to notice the structures and norms that undergirded their own circumstances. The more they became aware of political alternatives, the more they reflected upon their own values and their own life choices, noticing how they were embedded in the political and the patriarchal. It reminds me of historian Linda Gordon, who showed at length how conversations between female friends were among the most powerful incubators of feminist consciousness. For instance, Melnikovskaya and Yar were both in their 20s at the time of writing, and they both wrote at length about whether or not women could pursue a career and motherhood. Jean Yar, as I mentioned, was a New Yorker. She grew up on the Lower East Side in a family of garment workers. And before she was married, she became the breadwinner of her family after her father, who was a longshoreman, had a debilitating back injury. But by the time she corresponded with Melnikovskaya, Yar was married and a stay-at-home mother of these two beautiful children here, Mark and Joanne. And Jean Yar, of course, loved them to bits, and she wrote about this. But she also wrote extensively about longing to take on work outside the home. And she confided this to her Soviet pen friend, writing, "I would be very happy to have some kind of work, but of course one can't speak about that." Or, "There's almost nothing to say about my activities in the capacity of a homemaker." Or, "I'm busy with such problems that occupy all housewives, tedious housework." And Melnikovskaya responded by asking, quote, "Well, I don't understand why you can't go out to work. Because it's hard to get work? Or because there's no need for you to work? Or because you must take care of your children? Why can't Joanne go to after-school classes?" End quote. "Could Mark be sent to a nursery school?" And Yar explains no, because, quote, "classes for young people are so expensive." And she goes on to explain this catch-22 of how women needed money to pay for childcare, but they could not go out and earn that money without someone to look after their children. Yar tried to explain this system to her pen pal, calling it, quote, "a problem for which there is no solution." But of course, there was a solution, according to Olga Melnikovskaya: state-subsidized daycares and summer camps. She writes, quote, "I'm very sorry I have no children, but even if I had children, I'd go on working because I can't imagine life without work." Melnikovskaya was doing her PhD in archaeology at the time at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. Now, when I found these letters in the archive, they were all out of order. And when I read that line, "I would go on working because I can't imagine life without work," my first impression, and maybe yours, was, wow, she's really saying sort of what her Soviet overseers want to say, or she really sounds like she's sort of towing the party line. But behind this kind of sloganish remark was actually a very painful story that came divulged through a number of letters later, that Melnikovskaya didn't want to tell her pen friend right away. Melnikovskaya explained that during the war, she began studying archaeology. I'm going to skip ahead here. I somehow got a tiny bit off of my slides. That she started studying archaeology in Leningrad during the Second World War. And at that time, her fiancé was sent to the front, and she stayed in the city until she was so emaciated and weakened with hunger that she was evacuated out. She was too physically weak to bear children, and her fiancé, she explains, perished at the front. So it was because of this that Melnikovskaya threw herself into her scholarship. Work was her refuge, and her colleagues at work were her support system. She writes, "I can't imagine how I would ever been able to bear all I've had to live through in any other country. Here, we're never left by our lone self." Later, I discovered that this story both revealed an emotional truth and concealed quite a bit of information. Melnikovskaya went on to write a memoir in 2007. And in that text, she explains that her fiancé was not killed in action. In fact, he survived the war. But he was so stricken with post-traumatic stress disorder that he found himself unable to love her or be affectionate with her. And this sent her into a spiral of confusion and suicidal thoughts. So the emotional core of both of these stories, sort of the death of a marriage and the disappearance of a person she loved, those emotional cores are similar, but the details are different. And I think it's a good example of how you have both emotional openness and also self-censorship coexisting in these letters. Yar and Melnikovskaya often exchange thoughts about career and motherhood. And through the kind of alchemy of conversation, they learned about the obstacles and opportunities that women in each of their respective countries faced. And they imagined alternative ways of living. I want to wrap up so we have time for Q&A, but I'll skip briefly to the 1950s. By this time, Yar and Melnikovskaya were no longer corresponding, but I like to imagine, and I think that their conversations may have lingered in their minds. As Melnikovskaya was married and she started a family, and Yar in turn embarked upon a career. As they both struggled then to balance labor inside and outside the home, I surmise that they must have thought back, at least occasionally, to their conversations about this with new appreciation and new understanding. After all, they carried on that conversation at a great price, at great risk. In her memoir, Melnikovskaya writes about how difficult it was to care for her daughter, Antonina, stories that many of us are familiar with as parents, walking the screaming infant up and down, in this case, the streets of Moscow all night. And in the morning, she says, I had to go to work. And during those exhausting months, did she recall Jean Yar's regular protestations that she didn't have enough energy to care for 2 children, keep house, and hold down a job? Melnikovskaya really struggled to identify with Yar in 1949 and 1950 and 1951. But after Antonina is born in 1953, her pen friend's predicament may have hit home. Melnikovskaya had proposed public daycare as a simple solution to Yar, but now she confronted the reality that there were no vacancies for her daughter in any state-subsidized daycares. Meanwhile, with her children reaching high school, Jean Yar became a secretary at the International Paper Company, then headquartered in New York City. And she wrote numerous letters to her children over the years. And in them, she conveyed the same exuberance for work, almost in the same phrasing that Melnikovskaya had expressed about archaeology, saying, quote, I can't imagine my life without it, end quote. Yar moves up the ranks. She gets her own credit card, something that's almost unheard of for American women at the time, and again wrote her children numerous letters about her newfound independence. Those letters also document how she still did all the cooking and all the cleaning for her husband, who managed to boil water but not run the vacuum cleaner, as one of her children told me. She wrote regularly things like, I'm just so tired and too tied down with darn too much to do. Yar reluctantly retired from the International Paper Company when it moved its headquarters out of New York in 1987. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that Melnikovskaya became a mother because of Yar's loving stories about Mark or Joanne. You can see them pictured here at their families, or that Yar took on a career solely inspired by Melnikovskaya. But I am suggesting that their years of correspondence may have expanded their horizons about what was possible for them to achieve as women and raise their awareness about constraints that women in their countries face. And I'm happy to provide examples from other pen pals if you're interested. This awareness was integral to the women's liberation movements that crystallized in the United States in the 1960s and beyond, and in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. In the end, none of the letter writers declared themselves turned to communism or capitalism, but quite a few declared themselves feminists. And these post-war years are part of what Dorothy Sue Cobble called that missing wave that connects international women's movements of the early 20th century with those of the late 20th century. Ironically, maybe, the folks who were most turned or converted by the Correspondence program were actually the members of the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, which was charged with organizing the pen pal program in the first place. We can see the impact of the program on Soviet policy in two specific domains, in terms of women's rights and in citizen diplomacy. And they were both spearheaded by the head of the committee, Nina Vasilievna Popova. Popova, on numerous occasions testifying before the Central Committee and the Soviet Supreme Court, quoted from the American letters in order to push for better work conditions for women, as well as greater reproductive rights for women in the USSR. She used letters to get everything from better overalls to shorter working hours to taking women out of dangerous work, and she was an integral part of the campaign to re-legalize abortion in the Soviet Union in 1955. Popova, someone should really write a book about her. She was amazing and almost completely understudied. She also became the first head of an organization called SOD, which you may know. It was the organization responsible for Soviet citizen diplomacy in the post-Stalin years. And in 1958, once she assumed that position, she suggested that they start a massive pen pal campaign, this time with men and women in the capitalist West. And this idea seems so outlandish and so risky to many historians of citizen diplomacy that most of them argue that it was completely out of character with the Soviet Union and that Popova must have gotten this idea from Eisenhower's 1956 People-to-People program. But in fact, Popova was drawing on the pen pal program she had already overseen for 13 years by that point. This unknown program actually became the model for Soviet citizen diplomacy in the era of the thaw, even though it's really a product of the Second World War and the Stalin era. So in this sense, the program did impact state politics, but just in the opposite way than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had intended. Maybe I'll just leave us with a final thought that I learned from this project, and that is a good conversation stays with us. Its impact can be indirect but powerful, diffuse but lasting. Conversations plant little seeds and create little ripples, and those ripples can stream into the major currents of thought that help define our times. So I'll stop there and look forward to your thoughts and questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, let me start just with a remark. I saw your last slide with the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, and I noticed Valentina Tereshkova there, the first woman in space. That's a nice connection to our exhibition next year about the cosmos, competing cosmologies, where Valentina plays a role. But maybe you allow me to ask a first question. I was curious. You mentioned that these women on both sides were regular women, but I assume that the correspondence was all in English. I also assume that not all average Soviet women could write in English. So was the selection of Soviet women more like an elitist group, or what would you say about it?
Well, thank you, and thanks for that remark about Tereshkova. I'll have to come back for that exhibition. Tereshkova takes over for Popova as the head of this organization. It gets renamed the Soviet Women's Committee, but it's the same one. Two really good questions and thoughts rolled into your query. So actually, the letters were translated from English into Russian and Russian into English. And while I was in the archive, when the archive record was complete, which wasn't always the case, I actually brought a picture for you because I was hoping someone would ask me this question. I compared the Russian and the English to see how good the translations were or how accurate they were. And they were pretty decent. And all of the translation was done on the Soviet side. So the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee did all the translation. They also did the censoring, too. So here's a little picture of that. I didn't want to bore you with logistics, but I brought pictures just in case because they're so fascinating. The censorship's actually quite light, probably because Soviet women already knew how to self-censor, so they didn't bring up things they knew were going to be cut, for example, or too contentious to include. But the women, I mean, they style themselves as ordinary women. They present themselves that way, but I would say they weren't really ordinary in so many respects. I mean, anybody who would send a letter and then keep sending letters to a person they don't know across the Iron Curtain was already not an ordinary person or a typical person. Someone willing to sort of put themselves into the fore of international politics and take the risks involved are already special and I think particular. But styling themselves as ordinary was really important. And not being from elite backgrounds was really important because it allowed them to do a couple things. One was for them to distance themselves from their politicians, as if to say, you know, our statesmen make decisions, but ordinary people don't agree with those things. Like, those weren't my decisions. I don't stand by all those things, which was very advantageous. And then also to represent themselves as ordinary in the sense of being typical and to say that their experiences were similar to so many other women in their country. And so, by extension, if they really wanted to work for peace, then that was an indication that almost all women, or women in general, wanted to do this. There was a lot of sort of essentializing of femininity and womanhood to sort of facilitate these conversations. A lot of statements about all women want this, or as women we want this, particularly to prevent our children from going to war. So ordinariness was a kind of a useful concept that they used, even though in many respects they were quite extraordinary people.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, there are a few, there's a lot of questions there. Maybe we start here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your excellent talk. It was really inspiring and fascinating and actually comforting when you consider what's going on today. I'm curious, I have two questions. What led you to this important and new research, and then would you ever expand it to include writing about Popova, if I said her name correctly?
Yeah, terrific questions. This was just luck. I was in Russia in the State Archive, as you mentioned. I started the project in 2016, and I was actually going to do a totally separate topic. So I ordered files from this organization, the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, that did all kinds of things. But I was envisioning a little bit of a part 2 of my first book. My first book was about wartime experience, and I was thinking, an interesting project would be the rebuilding of the Soviet Union after the war, which was predominantly done by women because they were the able-bodied population, along with German POWs and others. So I ordered these files, and I opened up the file, and you know how these things are, right? They're just kind of boxes with stuff stuffed in there, and there were some letters, and I thought, that's interesting. I wonder how many more there are, and I kind of dismissed it, and then they showed up in more files and more files. Then I began to sort of systematically look for them. I got excited, as I mentioned to you. Then I got nervous and thought, maybe this is all some kind of hoax. Like, maybe there's 2 guys in a room smoking cigars, like, I'm going to be Gladys and I'm going to be Betty, or, whoever. Like, they were just fabricated. So then I really wanted to make sure that these were, in fact, real people whose lives I could document and follow up on before I kind of went down the rabbit hole. But in the end, I found thousands of letters. And there are thousands more letters that the Soviet organization helped to facilitate between women in the Soviet Union and other countries. And there are other scholars writing on the British letters and in letters to Chinese communist women, and also letters to the developing world at the time. So it was really quite a massive project, just one I had never learned about. Your second question about Popova, that's really interesting. She was really a kind of remarkable person, one of the only women who was ever in the Central Committee. And she became a real advocate, and I will consider writing about her. I already got my finger in a couple other pies I'm excited about, but she does really deserve to be credited with the work she did, because there's a very perpetual image of Soviet women as not genuinely devoted to the women's movement, that they were really just there to be mouthpieces of the party, and they weren't real feminists the way women in liberal democracies were. But you can see, with all the constraints on sort of what she can do and what she can say, she maneuvers beautifully and really pushes for policy change, which she achieves. So I think it would be worth shedding light on. Even when living in an authoritarian society, there's a lot of room for creativity and for advocacy.
Yeah. Next, over there.
Yeah. I was born there, and I was the first-hand witness. And before anybody here says that I'm a vile anti-communist, I want to say that I had a wonderful, happy childhood growing up there. So I'm not an anti-communist. But listening to your story, I want to appreciate your kindness and your optimism in it. But on the other hand, I want to mention, I hope you don't take offense, that how little it was said and how much more were behind your positive thoughts about those women. The whole thing was engineered by the party. My grandparents lived in the United States. We were not allowed to correspond with them. The whole thing was just a show. And those letters were empty letters with a few little lines that were allowed them to do. They were so empty and not interesting and not important. Also, the issue of feminism is so completely different in the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1917, when the communists took over, they were declared that the rights of men and women were equal. And Russian women did not have any reason to fight for being feminists. They didn't, because they participated in the life of the country, not maybe equally entirely, but equally enough. And in the United States, it was completely different. It was only in the 1960s, women had the right to vote. So it's very hard to compare the feminist movement in the United States and here. When I came here, I was shocked and I was envious by women who were playing in parks with their children. And I thought that they were privileged, rather than not given opportunities to work. They were privileged to be able to see their children during daylight. So it's a very difficult thing. So I feel that it was a good effort, but it was all engineered by the party for political reasons. A few things trickled down because we're people, we have hearts, you're right. But most of it was just a show. Also, on the same picture with Tereshkova was the picture of Dolores Ibaruri. And that's another story there that needs to be told. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I really appreciate it. And certainly your perspective is one that was prevalent. It was one that I also feared would be true before I did additional research. It was definitely the attitude of both the State Department and the Central Committee. Yeah. Oh, yes. Uh-huh. Yes, of course. That's the most famous one by far. Absolutely. Yeah, so this is an important part of the story. Yes, thank you. Because what you're saying is absolutely true. That's why I was shocked to find these kinds of letters, because absolutely people were prevented from writing to their loved ones. This kind of communication was prohibited. And yes, the other anti-fascist committees were immediately shut down, except for two, the Committee of Women and the Committee of Youth. And of course, as you say, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was famously destroyed. Its members were murdered, assassinated, a part of this anti-Semitic Zhdanoshina, right, that occurred after the war, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign and so forth. Absolutely. And your perspective, I understand what you're saying, but I think I started where you were. With that point of view, and the more I looked at the letters and the more I dug, the more I had to reckon with the fact that they existed. And then speaking with the families of letter writers, I learned from that even though this was officially orchestrated, to be sure, absolutely orchestrated, something like this would not have been possible without party orchestration and permission, to be sure. But just because something is orchestrated doesn't mean that something of value can't be communicated. It doesn't mean people then must not think or feel anything about what they wrote, that they're just merely writing something that they're being told to write. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And in addition to that, what was really interesting was that I went through all of the party documents, the state documents. I went through the audits of the Anti-Fascist Committee. I went through the reports about censorship. And in those reports, what you see over and over again is frustration on the part of the leaders of the committee, as well as those higher up in the party overseeing them, that the Soviet letter writers were not following their instructions. They were not doing the kind of propaganda work that they wanted. They repeatedly said, you have to coach these women about what to write. And people like Popova said, we are. And there were some specific mandates, like, for example, you have to promote the Soviet Peace Committee. Right? Ask them to do this. Certain official late Stalin-era initiatives, part of the Cultural Cold War. And so I looked for that in the letters, having seen this mandate, and the Soviet Peace Committee comes up in two letters only. Out of 762 letter writers, only 2 letter writers mentioned the Soviet Peace Committee, and they did it like this, writing to their American pen pal, "Are you aware of the Soviet Peace Committee?" And the person wrote back, "No." And that was the end of the conversation. So it wasn't exactly promotion. So I appreciate and respect your point of view and absolutely see the truth in it. On the other hand, this program is a really kind of interesting outlier. And in terms of what you say about feminism, yes, I mean, these were really different kinds of movements. And the Soviet feminist movement as feminism doesn't emerge until later. It's on a different timeline. And Soviet and American women who identify as feminists, including the ones I talked to, had sort of opposite demands, right? American women are demanding an opportunity to work. Soviet women are demanding the opportunity not to have to work all the time and to spend time with their children. And though I only gave you some small examples to help you learn about one pair of letter writers, many Soviet women are extremely transparent about how hard their lives are, how they don't see their children. Most of the Soviet women who write are widows and single mothers. And they're writing from a place of poverty and struggle. And they don't conceal that. Melnikovskaya is a bit of an exception because she doesn't have a child while she's writing. But the Soviet women who are mothers speak transparently about how difficult it is, how sick their children are after the war. Many of them end up in Moscow because they are refugees from somewhere else. So that story of struggle during the war was a critical part of the communication. And that's something I think, though orchestrated, doesn't mean it's fabricated.
Thank you. Totally on top.
I'm curious how they chose the women in the United States. And I find your talk absolutely fascinating. It's just a gem of history. Really.
I was a shock. I spent years telling students this kind of thing didn't happen, right? And now I feel foolish. Good question about the selection. So on the Soviet side, there's clear selection. During the war, and I'm getting to the American picture, I just want to give you the contrast. During the war, the women who are selected are women who are mostly doing classically, did I turn this off by mistake? Okay. Apologies. Classically male occupations during the war. So they're women who've taken over collective farms for their husbands. They're women who are in heavy industry jobs that were not typically done by women until the war years, and they're also fighting in the Red Army. After the war's over, when the goal shifts from rallying support for the war to promoting socialism, then Soviet women are chosen really carefully. They're not in the party, and there's a big discussion about whether they should have party women or not party women. But they are women who are, again, not typical. So they are in elite professions. Most of them have high education. And they're really chosen because, to paraphrase the Communist Party ideal, that the Soviet women would be these shining examples to American women of what was achievable for women under socialism. American women are not selected in the same way. There is an organization that runs the American side, but they don't do the same kind of systematic selection. The group that runs the American piece is called the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, which is a friendship group that had its roots in the interwar period, got mass appeal during World War II because they worked with Russian war relief. And then after the war, were repeatedly indicted as a subversive communist organization for like another 12 years after World War II. A lot of the women who ended up writing through them weren't recruited by them at all. They were women who were working with Russian war relief. So tended to be middle-class women. They tended to be white women. They tended to be women from the Midwest initially. And they were raising funds and creating care packages, et cetera, for the Red Army. And for Soviet civilians, and they would put letters in those care packages. And what happened was that the Soviet organization created a partnership with this National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. So what they did was they sent replies back to those American women, but only through that National Council. So the National Council would get the letters in New York City, and they were only a couple blocks from the Soviet consulate at the time, which was subsequently closed during the Cold War. And then they would distribute the letters to the American women. So what that means is that a lot of women from kind of moderate political backgrounds who otherwise wouldn't have any connection with the National Council suddenly became associated with them, which was dangerous during the McCarthy era, because now they were connected with what was seen as a left-wing fringe group. Fortunately for them, the lawyers in the Justice Department completely botched the case against the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, and none of them were penalized in the end. But many of them did experience blacklisting, and their husbands and their sons suffered because of their connections to the program.
Thank you. There's a question here. Yeah.
Yes, so my question was actually kind of related to that. You mentioned the State Department earlier, so really there was no oversight by the State Department or any national organization really in the United States.
Oh no, there was a lot of oversight.
Oh, okay.
The
okay.
FBI was onto this right away because sorry, it was a good question. I didn't mean to mislead you. The National Council of American-Soviet Friendship initially, they're not working with the Soviet organization. They also come up with this idea of a pen pal program. And their initial impulse is to do it between American GIs and men in the Red Army. And the FBI catches onto this right away and sends a list of American GIs who signed up for Soviet pen pals for surveillance. And this is one of the interesting parallels between the State Department and the Central Committee, is that both in the end decide this is too dangerous for men to do. Dangerous in the sense that men are too valuable, they're too risky, they're too connected to politics, they have military experience or military information. Women, on the other hand, are marginal, right? They're unimportant, they don't know anything. If they screw this up, no big security risk, right? And maybe they'll do a good job. This is why women and children do this in the Soviet Union, and women and girls only in the United States. Boys were not allowed to do this. The Boy Scouts were not, but the Campfire Girls and the Girl Scouts were. It was a very gendered decision. But the FBI and the State Department watch this from the beginning, and they decide that they'll let it carry out within reason, right, as long as it stays small and it's only between women, because they might get this intelligence. And who knows, maybe American women will do a good job promoting the American way of life. So they were onto it from the beginning. Yes. Yes, Yar was an example of that. And even when they moved, the FBI kept showing up just so that they knew they were there.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first one is about the relationships and the communication between the Soviet and American women. You said it's part of the program, and when the program ended, did the communication stop completely, or were there anybody who's trying to reach out to their pen pal on the other side?
Yeah.
And my second question, which is related, is if not, how were you able to, or like, can you explain a bit more behind your reasoning and how you build your argument based on these communications when it's only like, a moment in time? I'm just curious because I'm doing my PhD program and my research is also involved, or like correspondence is also a big part of what I look at. And I think sometimes I find it difficult to extrapolate from, these correspondence, these few letters that I have, to talk about like a relationship, trust, friendship, and all those things, especially in a transnational context.
Yes.
But thank you.
Yes. Remind me what the first question is really fast.
Did the communication end when the program ended?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Or?
Okay, thank you. So it's interesting. Initially, the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee starts this in 1941, and they're really unable to get the attention of American women. British women write back right away. In fact, British women are much more enthusiastic about this program than American women are. And they write in much greater numbers. American women don't really pay attention until 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad. And this is also kind of the height of an American promotion of the Soviet ally in Hollywood and Look magazine and Life magazine, all those places. And so from that point on, in 1943 on, the enthusiasm for this program comes almost entirely from the American side. The Soviet organization tries to cancel the program many times. In 1945, when the war's over, they figure, mission accomplished, right? We don't need this anymore. But they keep getting all of these letters from the United States. It's too much of a good propaganda opportunity to pass up. So they keep it going. And then they decide later in 51 that they're going to cancel it because these women meaning Soviet women, are not doing good, like they're not propagandizing enough. This is an ineffective use of resources, is what they say. But again, more and more letters from the United States arrive. In 51, however, they really cut the program back. they cut it back severely so that most of the women I write about, including people like Jean Yar, no longer get letters from their Soviet pen pals. It's the Soviet side that stops first. And there's no explanation. So then Americans write these painful letters like, did anything happen to her? Do you know if she's okay? Is her family okay? Is she ill? Is it something I said? Is she now in trouble? What's going on? And they never get any explanation. So most of the pen friendships I study really end in 51. But the pen pal program and the idea of it continues, and eventually it expands. So in 51, the Anti-Fascist Committee really truncates the initial programs they had with Britain, the United States, and France, obviously, right, because of the war legacy. And interestingly, in the British and French case, they have party women write to party women there, because most of the British and French women who write are communists, so they match them with Soviet women in the Communist Party. Not in the American case. It's different. So they truncate those programs and instead expand programs, for example, with China, with the Socialist Bloc, and with other countries where they feel like there's more potential for international socialist cooperation. And then eventually in 56, when Khrushchev comes to power, and then in 58 with the Lacey-Zarubin Agreement, you have tons of these kinds of initiatives, citizen diplomacy initiatives. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Correspondence, it's a really tricky and interesting source. So I would respond a little that this isn't one moment in time. This is 15 years of time. Correspondence is hard to use, I agree, when you only have dribs and drabs of it, a letter here and a letter there. So in my own project, I really tried to focus on the correspondences that were robust, where we have 15, 20, 30 letters. And that's a bit easier, because then correspondence is a wonderful source because each letter is unique and different. Each letter performs. It's sort of a curated self, right? It's not an authentic self, but it's an interestingly curated self. And then you could see that evolve over time. So each letter can be treated as its own artifact, or you can treat it as a corpus of text and look at the shifts over time. So I really appreciate that about it, but it is difficult to use and incredibly difficult to reconstruct, right? To find a substantial body of back and forth letters between two people.
In contemporary language, you would say each letter is a selfie.
That's right.
Okay, let's do one final question, which is the back row over there.
Hi, I just want to ask you, how did you get permission to get into the archive? Because I know that they kind of protected and certain timeline is not allowed still. So just was curious about that.
Yes. Well, this particular project I started in 2016, and that was still a much better time for archival access. It was, of course, pre-COVID as well, and there were a number of factors that made travel easier. Sanctions were more limited in those years, and certainly visas were still being distributed to Americans from Russia and vice versa. Now, of course, things have changed dramatically. So I didn't have trouble getting into this particular archive, which is known as GARF. It's the State Archive of the Russian Federation. That one doesn't have prohibitive restrictions on at the outset. You still have to get permission and have a letter and sometimes chat with the director to work there, but it's not the same as a military archive, for example, or others where, in general, people are prohibited from accessing them, especially foreigners, and you need much more special permission. I don't think this project would be feasible at a certain point in time, not so much because of the topic, but as you say, because of travel difficulties. I remember in the early days, I sent letters to a lot of the families of the Soviet writers, and all the letters were sent back because they violate US sanctions, for example. And of course, Russians were careful about speaking with me, if at all, because they're wary of surveillance, and as Americans are as well. So in some ways, that made the work feel even more important, but it did, of course, limit access to information. So I was lucky I started it when I did, I suppose, is a shorter answer to your question.
Alexis, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for your questions and your comments.